January 17th, 1944. The sky over German-occupied France hung heavy with winter clouds, the kind that turned the world below into a gray smudge of frozen earth and skeletal trees. At 23,000 feet, the cold was not merely felt, it invaded. It seeped through leather flight jackets, turned breath to ice crystals on oxygen masks, and made metal instruments painful to touch even through gloves. Second Lieutenant Robert M. Trimble of the 354th Fighter Squadron gripped the control stick of his P-51 Mustang, call sign Little Demon, as he led his formation back from a bomber escort mission deep into the Reich. The Merlin engine hummed its familiar song, a sound that had become as natural to him as his own heartbeat. Below, somewhere in that colorless landscape, were people who would kill him on sight. Above, the thin blue line between earth and void, and in his cockpit, the peculiar solitude that only fighter pilots knew, surrounded by machinery, suspended in space, utterly alone yet tethered to something larger than himself. He did not know that in 17 minutes, he would be walking through those frozen French fields with a shattered airplane behind him and an impossible journey ahead. The Second World War had transformed young men into navigators of the vertical frontier. By January 1944, the Allied air campaign over Europe had reached a devastating crescendo. Thousands of bombers, escorted by swarms of fighters, struck daily at the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. The 8th Air Force alone would drop more than 915,000 tons of bombs before the war's end. And the price was measured in aluminum wreckage scattered across occupied Europe, and thousands of young men who would never see home again. The life expectancy of a bomber crew member was 15 missions. Fighter pilots fared somewhat better, but only somewhat. They flew alone, fought alone, and when their aircraft failed, whether from enemy fire, mechanical failure, or simple misfortune, they fell alone. But the war had also created an intricate web of resistance beneath the conquered territories. From Norway to Greece, from the Netherlands to the Pyrenees, ordinary citizens became extraordinary warriors. They printed newspapers in cellars, hid Allied airmen in attics, and sabotaged railways in the darkness. In France, the various resistance networks, some communist, some Gaullist, some simply patriotic, formed a secret nation within the occupation. By 1944, the Maquis had evolved from scattered groups into an underground army, and one of their most vital missions was recovering Allied airmen who fell from the sky. The mathematics were simple and compelling. It cost roughly $1 million and 2 years to train a combat pilot. If the resistance could return him to England, he could fly again. A downed pilot was not merely a man to be saved, he was an investment to be recovered, a weapon to be returned to the arsenal. Robert Trimble understood none of this complexity, as his Mustang's Merlin engine coughed once, then twice, then ceased entirely. The sound, or rather, the sound, was wrong in a way that triggered every instinct. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. Instruments began their panicked dance, altitude unwinding, airspeed bleeding away, and below, that German-occupied Earth rushing up with mathematical certainty. He had expected that, if this moment came, there would be fire. That was what the intelligence officers described in their matter-of-fact briefings, illustrating with photographs of burned aircraft and sanitized language about thermal events and catastrophic failures. He had expected the violent chaos of combat damage, the hammer blow of flak, or the saw blade rattle of cannon fire. Instead, there was only this: silence where an engine should roar, and the sickening awareness that he was now a glider pilot in a fighter never designed to glide. The P-51 Mustang was a creature of speed and power. Without its engine, it became a very expensive stone. Training took over. Trim the aircraft. Choose a field. Check canopy. Ready to jettison. Harness tight. Radio call, though he knew no one would reach him in time. Little Demon going down. Sector 7. Engine failure. His voice steady, almost bored, the way they'd been taught to sound, even when the world was ending. Below, a patchwork of fields materialized through the clouds, some snow-covered, some brown with frozen earth. He aimed for the largest, hoping it was not mined, hoping the ground was not too soft, hoping for 1,000 things that were now entirely beyond his control. The Mustang hit hard. Not a landing, a controlled crash. The tail dug in first, then the nose, and the aircraft slewed sideways with a shriek of tortured metal. Trimble's head snapped forward against the gun sight despite his locked harness, and bright lights exploded behind his eyes. The world spun, tumbled, and finally stopped. Silence again, but different now. The silence of a dead machine. Fuel vapors filled the cockpit. Aviation gasoline, 100 octane, the smell that meant fire was coming. He tore at his harness with hands that suddenly refused to work properly. Fingers thick and clumsy. The canopy. Where was the canopy release? There. Jettison. The plexiglass flew away, and winter air rushed in, shockingly cold and perfectly clear. He hauled himself out, fell more than climbed, and ran stumbling through the snow. 20 yards, 50. He threw himself down behind a low stone wall and waited for the explosion. It never came. Little Demon sat silent in the field, nose buried, tail high, already gathering snow on its wings like a monument to bad luck. No fire, just silence, and the faint creak of cooling metal. Trimble lay in the snow and laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that he cut off quickly. Laughter carried. Sound discipline was for the infantry, but he was infantry now. A pilot without an airplane, a warrior without his weapon, an American in France, where Americans were shot on sight or shipped to camps from which few returned. He had expected that if he went down, rescue would be impossible. That was the doctrine they'd absorbed through countless briefings. Evade if possible, hide if necessary, but expect capture. The statistics were grimly clear. Of the roughly 20,000 Allied airmen shot down over Western Europe during the war, fewer than 5,000 would successfully evade capture and return to Allied lines. The odds were not encouraging. Yet Trimble carried in his flight suit a package that suggested someone believed in those odds. The escape kit. Silk maps printed with extraordinary detail. A compass disguised as a button. French and German currency. High-energy malted milk tablets. Water purification pills. And a phrase card with helpful expressions like, "I am an American," and "I will not be interrogated," in phonetic French and German. It was a kit designed by people who believed that intelligence, preparation, and courage could overcome mathematics. He checked himself for injuries. Bruised, certainly. His neck burned where the harness had caught him. His knee screamed complaints. But nothing broken, nothing bleeding. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, he could see smoke rising from a village. German garrison? French civilians? There was no way to know without getting closer. And getting closer meant exposure. He looked back at his aircraft. Standard procedure was to destroy it. Deny the enemy any intelligence, any salvageable parts. But he had no incendiary devices and no way to set the fuel tanks burning without immolating himself. The Mustang would have to stay intact, at least for now. Trimble oriented himself using the compass from his escape kit, and the pale sun barely visible through the overcast. The maps showed he had come down roughly 30 miles southeast of Reims, deep in occupied territory. The nearest Allied lines were hundreds of miles away in any direction. England across the Channel to the north, the advancing front lines somewhere far to the south in Italy, or east, where the war ground forward in blood and snow. Any direction meant crossing a continent at war, moving through a landscape where every road had checkpoints, every village had informers, and every German soldier carried a photograph identifying Allied airmen. The cold made decisions for him. January in northern France was survival weather. He could not simply hide in the woods and wait. He would freeze long before the war moved this far. He needed shelter, food, and help, which meant he needed to find the resistance, if they existed here, if they would trust him, if they could help him at all. What Robert Trimble could not have known, lying in that frozen field with his wrecked fighter behind him, was that his descent had already been observed. In occupied France, the sky was theater, and everyone watched. The housewife hanging laundry in the village of Courcelles-Sappicourt had seen the silver fighter trailing no smoke, gliding down in an unnaturally quiet death spiral. The schoolteacher in Montmort had heard the crash, distant but unmistakable. And in a stone farmhouse 3 kilometers from Trimble's position, a man named Jean-Claude Darras, farmer by day, resistance operative by necessity, was already pulling on his coat and loading a hunting rifle. Not to shoot the pilot, but to protect him. The race had begun. Resistance against the Germans, the hidden nation against the occupiers, and the prize was one American pilot who had no idea he had become valuable. Darras reached Trimble before the Germans did, but only barely. The farmer approached from downwind, moving with the careful quietness of a man who had hunted both animals and men. He carried no identifying papers, no weapons visible, nothing that would mark him as anything other than a peasant investigating a crash. When he was 20 meters away, he called softly in heavily accented English, "American, do not shoot, friend." Then, even more softly, he added the recognition phrase that identified him to Allied intelligence. "The snow falls in London." It was a code rotated monthly, shared through BBC radio broadcasts in the coded messages that preceded French-language programs. Trimble had memorized it without ever expecting to need it. "And the Thames runs cold," Trimble replied, giving the countersign. His voice shook slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline finally bleeding away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Darras moved quickly then. He stripped Trimble of his flight jacket, too obviously American, and replaced it with a worn wool coat that smelled of tobacco and farm animals. The leather helmet went into a sack, along with Trimble's May West life preserver and anything else that would identify him. "Germans come soon," Darras said. "Always they come when airplane falls. We must be gone." His English was functional but limited, cobbled together from school lessons decades ago and recent practice with other airmen. They moved away from the crash site, not running, but walking with the purposeful stride of men who belonged in the landscape. Behind them, Little Demon sat abandoned, already being dusted with fresh snow. Within an hour, a German patrol from the Luftwaffe Field Police would arrive to examine the wreckage and search for the pilot. They would find the aircraft largely intact but empty, the pilot's seat abandoned, and tracks leading away through the snow. Tracks that Darras and Trimble had deliberately obscured by walking through a stream, the icy water soaking through their boots but erasing their passage. The Germans would search but not find. Not this time. The safe house was a wine cellar, not metaphorically. Literally, a cellar carved into chalk hillside where generations had stored wine before the occupation. Now it stored fugitives. Trimble descended into darkness that smelled of mold and earth, and found he was not alone. 3 British airmen huddled in the cold, a Lancaster bomber pilot named Davies, his navigator Wilson, and a tail gunner so young he might have been 17. They had been shot down a week earlier and were waiting for the resistance to arrange their next movement along the escape line. They greeted Trimble with quiet exhaustion, the fellowship of shared danger. "Welcome to the Ritz," Davies said dryly. "No room service, I'm afraid, but the accommodations are absolutely bomb-proof." It was a joke, but barely. Above them, several feet of chalk and earth provided protection from everything except a direct hit. They waited in the darkness, measuring time by the occasional visit from resistance members who brought food and news. The food was meager, bread that was more sawdust than flour, thin soup, occasionally a piece of cheese that tasted like chalk. It was the diet of occupied France, where German requisitions had stripped the country nearly bare. The civilian population survived on roughly 1,200 calories per day, well below the minimum needed for health. They were slowly starving, and yet they shared what they had with enemy airmen. Trimble had expected many things from war, but not this: that the hungry would feed him, that the endangered would hide him, that strangers would risk execution to save him. Jean-Claude Darras explained the situation in his careful English. The escape line would move them south, then west toward the Pyrenees, and eventually to neutral Spain. It would take weeks, possibly months. They would travel by night, hidden in trucks beneath cargo, in attics, in barns, in the spaces between the war. Each leg would be arranged separately, each handler knowing only the previous and next links in the chain. This way, if someone was captured and tortured, they could only betray a small piece of the network. It was operational security born from hard experience. The Gestapo had already rolled up several escape lines through systematic interrogation and penetration agents. Many try to help, Darras said quietly. Some succeed, some. He made a gesture that indicated hanging, shooting, deportation to camps. The Boche, they offer money for Allied aviators. 1,000 francs, maybe more now. Some people, he didn't finish. Some people informed. Some people calculated that one American pilot was worth less than 1,000 francs and the goodwill of the occupation authorities. But some people risked everything for the principle that resistance was its own reward. Trimble asked the question that had haunted him since landing. Why do you do this? You could be killed. Darras considered this. His face, lit by a single candle, was weathered and lined beyond his years. Why do you fly? He asked finally. You could be killed, he shrugged. This is my mission. You bomb the Boche, I hide their enemies. We all fight. It was an answer that carried its own weight. The resistance did not fight for pay or glory or conquest. They fought because the alternative was collaboration, was surrender, was the death of something indefinable but essential. They fought to prove that France was not merely conquered, but hibernating, waiting for liberation. Every German train derailed, every factory sabotaged, every Allied airman returned to England was a small victory against impossible odds. The war had created strange warriors, farmers who memorized codes, teachers who forged documents, priests who smuggled weapons. They had expected occupation to mean submission. Instead, it had revealed that resistance was possible even in defeat. The days in the wine cellar blurred together, cold, dark, tedious, and terrifying in equal measure. They heard German patrols passing overhead, boots crunching in snow, voices loud with the confidence of conquerors. Once soldiers entered the building above them, searching for something. The airmen sat in perfect silence, barely breathing, while footsteps creaked across wooden floors. They heard furniture being moved, objects thrown. Then, after an eternity, the Germans left. Darras came down later, pale and shaking. They look for wine, he explained. I tell them resistance steal it all. They believe. He laughed, but it was the laugh of a man who understood how close death had passed. On the sixth night, they moved. A truck arrived after midnight, driven by a woman named Marie-France, whose husband had been shot by the Gestapo 6 months earlier. She explained the procedure with clinical precision. They would hide beneath a false floor in the cargo bed, covered by crates of turnips. The space was 18 inches high. They would not be able to sit up. They would remain silent regardless of what happened. The journey would take approximately 4 hours, passing through 2 German checkpoints. If they were discovered, she would claim ignorance, and they would be on their own. It was a matter-of-fact assessment of risks and responsibilities. The space beneath the false floor was exactly as terrible as described. Trimble lay on his back in absolute darkness, the wooden planks inches above his face, the smell of earth and turnips overwhelming. The truck's engine roared and they began to move, every bump and pothole translating directly into his spine. Next to him, he could hear the British gunner breathing rapidly, on the edge of panic. Someone, Davies, probably, whispered the only thing that mattered. Steady on. The first checkpoint came after an hour. The truck slowed, stopped. German voices, loud and authoritative. Marie-France responded in fluent German, her voice friendly and cooperative. Papers rustled. Footsteps walked around the truck. Then, horribly, someone climbed into the cargo bed. Boots walked across the false floor, directly over Trimble's head. The wood creaked. Crates were moved, shifted, inspected. A voice said something about requisitioning produce. Marie-France argued. These turnips were already requisitioned. See the paperwork. She was delivering to the garrison at Epernay. More discussion. Then laughter, and the boots left. The truck moved forward. Beneath the floor, 4 men released breath they hadn't known they were holding. The second checkpoint was easier, or perhaps they were simply too exhausted to feel terror. Papers checked, truck waved through. They drove on through the night. And when the truck finally stopped and the false floor was removed, they emerged into a barn somewhere in the Champagne region, surrounded by people they had never met who were risking everything for them. The pattern repeated: hide, wait, move. From the barn to a church. From the church to a safe house in Châlons-en-Champagne. From there to a doctor's office in Troyes, where their false papers were prepared. The resistance forgers were artists of necessity, creating documents that could pass German inspection. Trimble became Robert Trimble, a deaf-mute agricultural worker from Alsace, a cover story that explained his inability to speak German or French fluently. The papers included employment certificates, residence permits, even a medical document explaining his condition. The attention to detail was extraordinary. The forgers knew that poor documentation meant death for the airman and for everyone who had helped him. In Troyes, Trimble finally understood the scale of what had been created. The escape lines were not improvised or haphazard. They were organized with military precision. The Comet Line alone, running from Belgium through France to Spain, would eventually return over 700 Allied servicemen to England. The Pat O'Leary Line, the Shelburne Line, the Marie Claire Network. Together they formed a secret railway running beneath the occupation, powered by courage and maintained by people who understood that every airman returned was both a moral victory and a strategic asset. But the lines were fragile. As Trimble prepared to move south toward the Pyrenees, news arrived that sent the resistance network into panicked reorganization. The Gestapo had arrested 17 members of the network in Paris. The line was compromised. Routes had to be changed, safe houses abandoned, contacts warned. Some people simply disappeared, melting into the population or fleeing to Spain ahead of the arrest waves. Others stayed, accepting the heightened risk because there was no one else to do the work. The escape line adapted. Instead of the established route through Paris, they would take a more dangerous path through the eastern departments, closer to the German border, through territory with heavier patrols but less compromised networks. It would add weeks to the journey. Trimble and the 3 British airmen were separated. More people together meant more risk of discovery. Davies and his crew went west. Trimble went south with a new handler, a teenage boy named Philippe, who looked far too young to be playing these lethal games. Philippe was 17, the same age as many of the soldiers fighting across Europe, and he moved through occupied France with the confidence of someone who had grown up learning to deceive. His family had been resistance from the beginning. His father was in a forced labor camp in Germany. His older brother had been shot during a sabotage operation, and his mother ran messages between cells while pretending to be simply a war widow shopping for food. Philippe himself served as a courier and guide, his youth and innocent appearance allowing him to move through checkpoints with less scrutiny than an adult might face. They traveled by bicycle, the universal transportation of occupied Europe. Trimble pedaled behind Philippe through winter landscapes that might have been beautiful in other circumstances: snow-covered vineyards, medieval villages, forests stripped bare by winter and foraging. But beauty was irrelevant. What mattered were the German positions, the patrol schedules, the locations of Wehrmacht barracks and Gestapo offices. Philippe knew them all, had memorized them the way students memorize mathematics. At checkpoints, he did the talking, presenting their papers with the bored confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Trimble played his role, the deaf-mute worker, staring blankly ahead, unremarkable and forgettable. Near Dijon, their luck nearly ran out. A Wehrmacht patrol stopped them on a rural road, not a checkpoint, but a random spot check. An officer examined their papers with more attention than usual, looking from the documents to their faces and back. Something had made him suspicious, some detail wrong, some instinct triggered. He spoke to Philippe in German. Philippe responded in schoolboy German, explaining they were going to work in the vineyards near Beaune. The officer turned to Trimble and asked a question. Trimble stared blankly. Perfect deaf-mute performance. The officer asked again, louder, as if volume could overcome deafness. Philippe interjected, pointing to the medical certificate. The officer read it, still suspicious. He called over a sergeant. The sergeant looked at the papers, looked at Trimble, and said something that made the officer laugh. They waved them through. Later, Philippe explained. The sergeant had said that anyone faking being deaf-mute would pick something more dignified, not something that made them look simple. The prejudices of the occupation had saved them. They reached the foothills of the massive Central in early February. The plan had changed again. The Pyrenees routes were under increased surveillance after recent arrests, so they would wait in the mountains until things cooled down. Philippe brought Trimble to a farmhouse so remote it seemed to exist outside time. The family who lived there, an elderly couple named Laurent, had been hiding Allied airmen for 2 years. They had a system. The airmen stayed in the barn loft during the day, came into the house only after dark, and were never mentioned in any conversation that could be overheard. The Laurents were Catholic in the profound way of rural France, and they treated hiding Allied soldiers as a moral obligation, something between charity and resistance. Madame Laurent was perhaps 70, bent with age and arthritis, and she cooked for Trimble with the determination of someone who had decided this was her war contribution. The food was still meager. The occupation had stolen France's plenty, but she made it stretch. Potato soup with a scrap of bacon. Bread baked from whatever grain could be ground. Once chicken, a luxury that made Trimble understand how much she was sacrificing. She asked nothing in return except that he tell her about America. He tried. In his halting French, supplemented by Philippe's translation and hand gestures, he described a country that seemed mythical in its abundance. Supermarkets full of food, cars for ordinary people, cities lit at night without blackout curtains. The Laurents listened as if he were describing heaven, because in a sense he was. A world where basic prosperity was not a dream but a fact, where you could buy meat without ration cards, where the primary concern was not survival, but comfort. "This is why they fear you," Monsieur Laurent said quietly. "Not your bombs or guns. They fear that their people will learn that life can be different." It was an insight that Trimble had never considered. The ideology of fascism required the belief that struggle was eternal, that hierarchy was natural, that sacrifice was the highest virtue. But America represented a different idea, that abundance was possible, that ordinary people could live extraordinary lives, that freedom meant not just liberty, but opportunity. It was a threat more fundamental than military power. It was a threat to the entire worldview that justified dictatorship. The Germans came to the Laurent farm on February 18th. Not for Trimble. They had no idea he was there, but for grain requisitions. A squad of Wehrmacht soldiers, accompanied by a French collaborationist official, arrived to search the farm and confiscate any food beyond the authorized rations. It was legalized theft, the slow starvation of occupied Europe to feed the German war machine. Trimble hid in the loft of the barn, buried under hay, While below, German soldiers poked through the Laurents' meager stores and took most of what they found. He heard Madame Laurent crying, pleading that they would starve. The soldiers were unmoved. They had their orders. France would feed Germany, and if French civilians starved, that was simply the arithmetic of conquest. After they left, Monsieur Laurent came to the barn. His face was gray with exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness of the soul. "They take everything," he said. "Every year they take more. Soon there will be nothing left to take." And then he didn't finish. But Trimble understood. The occupation was not just a military fact, but an existential threat. France was being consumed, systematically drained of resources, people, and hope. The resistance was not optional. It was survival. The irony was impossible to miss. The Laurents had less food because of the requisition, yet they continued to share with Trimble. When he offered to leave, to reduce the burden, they refused with the fierce pride of people who would not be conquered. "You will eat," Madame Laurent said firmly. "You will go home. You will fly again and bomb the Boche. This is how we win." March brought thaw and news. The Pyrenees route was open again. The resistance had reorganized after the arrests, established new contacts, and confirmed safe passage through Spain. Trimble would leave in a group of 6 airmen, 3 Americans, 2 British, 1 Canadian, all of whom had been moving through various safe houses and now converged for the mountain crossing. They met at a staging house in Perpignan, within sight of the Pyrenees, those mountains that represented the last barrier between occupation and freedom. Their guide was a Basque smuggler named Echegaray, who had been moving people across the Pyrenees since before the war. Refugees, fugitives, and now Allied airmen. He was in his 50s, weathered like old leather, and he explained the journey with the clinical detachment of someone who had done this too many times. 2 nights walking. Very steep. You follow. You do not speak. You do not stop. If you cannot keep up, you stay in the mountain. I do not wait. It was harsh but honest. The Gestapo patrolled the approaches to the mountains, and the mountains themselves killed the unprepared through cold, falls, or simple exhaustion. They departed at dusk on March 8, 1944. 6 airmen, Echegaray, and 2 resistance members who would only go as far as the Spanish border. They climbed through foothills in gathering darkness, moving steadily upward into terrain that became progressively more hostile. The mountains in winter were unforgiving. Snow, ice, rocks that crumbled underfoot. Trimble's knee, injured in the crash 2 months earlier, screamed with every step. The Canadian pilot fell twice, tearing his hands on rocks, but kept going. They all kept going because stopping meant capture, and capture meant camps, and death or something worse. At midnight, they rested briefly in a shepherd's hut. Echegaray allowed them 5 minutes, no more. They ate chocolate from British escape kits, dense, sweet, calorie-rich, and drank snow melted in their mouths. Then up again, climbing toward the passes. Trimble's world narrowed to the boots of the man in front of him, to breathing, to the simple mechanics of placing 1 foot ahead of the other. This was not flying. This was the oldest form of escape. Walking away from danger, step by step, mile by mile. Dawn found them at the ridgeline, straddling the border between France and Spain. Behind them, occupied Europe. Ahead, neutral Spain, which was technically non-belligerent, but would intern them briefly before allowing passage to Allied authorities. It was not freedom yet, but it was not captivity either. It was the space between, and it was enough. Echegaray shook each of their hands. "Go," he said. "That way, Spain. Walk 1 hour, you find border post. They take you." Then he turned back toward France, back into danger, because there were more airmen to guide, and the war was not finished. They walked into Spain as the sun rose. An hour later, as promised, they encountered a Spanish border patrol. The guards were bored and bureaucratic, and they processed the airmen with weary efficiency. another group of Allied fugitives, the third this week. The 6 men were taken to a camp in Miranda de Ebro, technically an internment facility, but functionally a way station. British intelligence maintained contacts in Spain, and within 2 weeks, arrangements were made. The airmen were escaped from internment, driven to Gibraltar, and flown back to England. Robert Trimble landed at RAF Tangmere on March 29, 1944, 71 days after crashing in France. He was debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted every detail: names, locations, procedures, contacts. The information would help other evaders, would support resistance operations, would be added to the vast machinery of intelligence that underpinned the war. Then he was given medical clearance, granted brief leave, and asked a question. Did he want to return to flight status? He said yes without hesitation. He had expected that the crash, the escape, the weeks of danger would leave him traumatized, unwilling to risk the sky again. Instead, he found the opposite. The farmers and teachers and teenagers who had risked everything to save him had given him a debt that could only be repaid one way: by flying again, by continuing the mission, by ensuring their courage meant something. He thought of Darras and Philippe and the Lawrence and Echegaray and all the others whose names he had never learned. They had fought their war on the ground, with no weapons except courage and no protection except cunning. The least he could do was fight his war in the air. He returned to the 354th Fighter Squadron in April 1944. His P-51 had been replaced. Little Demon was presumably being studied in some Luftwaffe technical facility, and he was assigned a new aircraft. He flew through D-Day and beyond, through the summer campaign across France, and he was in the air the day Allied forces liberated the region where he had crashed. Somewhere down there, he thought, Jean-Claude Darras was watching Allied fighters overhead and knowing that the resistance had been worth it, that the liberation had come, that the years of darkness were ending. The resistance paid heavily for their courage. Of the approximately 100,000 active resistance members in France, roughly 30,000 were killed during the occupation, shot, hanged, worked to death in camps, or simply disappeared into the machinery of Nazi repression. The networks that ran the escape lines were particularly targeted. The Gestapo understood that returning Allied airmen to combat was a strategic threat. Marie-France, the truck driver who had hidden them beneath turnips, was arrested in May 1944 and deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She survived, barely, and after the war received recognition from multiple Allied governments. Philippe was killed during the Paris uprising in August 1944, shot by a German sniper 3 weeks before the city was liberated. He was 17. The Laurents survived the war, though Monsieur Laurent died in 1946 from malnutrition-related complications. Madame Laurent lived until 1968, long enough to see the France she had fought to save rebuilt and prosperous. Echegaray continued guiding escapees over the Pyrenees until the liberation, then returned to smuggling, which was his profession regardless of politics. He died in 1959, having never spoken publicly about the war. The number of airmen he saved was estimated at over 200, but exact records were not kept. The work was too dangerous for documentation. Robert Trimble survived the war with 17 confirmed aerial victories and a distinguished Flying Cross. But the decoration he valued most was not from his own military but from France, the Croix de Guerre and the Légion d'honneur, presented in 1945 in recognition not of his combat service, but of what he had represented to those who saved him. He was, they said, a symbol of why they had resisted, because defeating fascism meant preserving the possibility of a world where young men could fly without fear, where abundance was shared rather than hoarded, where freedom was not just a word, but a lived reality. In 1962, 18 years after the war, Trimble returned to France to find the people who had saved him. Some were dead, some had moved, But he found Jean-Claude Darras, older and grayer but alive, still farming the same land where he had once hidden fugitive airmen. They spoke through an interpreter. Trimble's French had not improved much, and Darras asked the question that had haunted him. Was it worth it? Did we make a difference? Trimble told him about the missions he had flown after returning, about the targets destroyed, about the war won. But he also told him something more important, that the experience of being saved by strangers, of being hidden and fed and protected by people who owed him nothing, had changed how he understood the war. It was not just about defeating armies. It was about proving that ordinary people, when faced with evil, could choose courage. That a farmer with a hunting rifle and a teenager on a bicycle and an elderly couple with a barn could stand against empires. That resistance was possible even in the darkest times, and that every small act of defiance accumulated into something larger than itself. The story of a pilot who crashed behind enemy lines and flew home again is not unique. Thousands of Allied airmen were shot down, hidden, and returned to combat through the escape lines. But each story carried its own truth, its own testimony to the capacity of human courage. They expected to die alone in crashed aircraft or prisoner of war camps. Instead, they discovered that even in occupied territory, even in the heart of enemy land, there were people who believed that some things, freedom, dignity, resistance, were worth dying for. Robert Trimble's crash landing in January 1944 should have been the end of his war. By all reasonable calculation, he should have been captured, interrogated, and imprisoned. That he was not, that he walked out of France and flew again, was due to the conscious choice of dozens of people to risk everything for a stranger. They did not do this because it was easy or safe or rewarded. They did it because the alternative, allowing the occupation to be total, allowing resistance to die, allowing the ideology of conquest to triumph, was unthinkable. The war created many technologies and tactics, but its most enduring legacy may be the proof that ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, are capable of extraordinary things, that a wine cellar could become a fortress, that a truck full of turnips could be a weapon, that a deaf-mute act and forged papers and a guide through mountains could defeat armies. The machinery of oppression was vast and powerful, but it could be resisted, piece by piece, person by person, choice by choice. When Robert Trimble died in 1999, his obituary mentioned his 17 aerial victories and his decorations. But at his funeral, among the Air Force officers and fellow veterans, there was a small delegation from France, descendants of the people who had saved him, carrying a wreath and a message. It read, simply, "The snow falls in London, and the Thames runs cold." The codes were obsolete, the war long over, but the meaning remained. Once in darkness, strangers had chosen to be heroes, and because of that choice, a young pilot had flown home again.